December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The sun had barely cleared the Kula Range when the first wave struck. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circled his Nakajima B-5N above the carnage, smoke rising in black columns from Battleship Row, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Below him, the Arizona burned. The Oklahoma had capsized. 8 battleships lay crippled or destroyed. Around him, his pilots banked and dove with precision born of months of training, their strikes methodical, devastating, nearly perfect. From the cockpit, Fuchida could see American sailors scrambling across oil-slicked water, their ships reduced to twisted steel monuments. The scent of burning oil mixed with cordite hung thick in the tropical air. In that moment, watching the Pacific Fleet hemorrhage into the harbor, the outcome seemed foregone. Japan had struck the first blow. America would negotiate withdrawal, concede Japan's sphere of influence in Asia. That was the calculation. That was the plan. Fuchida transmitted his famous signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 the code confirming complete surprise. As his aircraft turned north toward the carrier Akagi, he looked back one final time at the destruction. What he could not see from that altitude, what no Japanese commander fully grasped in that hour of triumph, was that they had awakened something far more dangerous than battleships. They had awakened an industrial colossus that would soon rewrite the mathematics of naval warfare itself. The Japanese had studied American industrial capacity. They had read the reports, analyzed the statistics, reviewed the intelligence assessments. But numbers on paper carried no weight, inspired no fear. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned the imperial staff of America's productive power. He had lived in the United States, seen Detroit's assembly lines, witnessed the casual abundance of American manufacturing. His warnings went unheeded. Most Japanese commanders viewed American industry through a lens of contempt, soft, undisciplined, concerned more with consumer luxuries than instruments of war. They saw a nation of individualists incapable of the collective sacrifice required for total war. They saw assembly lines producing automobiles and refrigerators, not warships. They saw a people accustomed to comfort, not hardship. They were catastrophically wrong. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, American industry underwent a transformation so rapid, so comprehensive, that it would have seemed impossible to those who witnessed it. Factories that had produced automobiles began producing tanks. Plants that manufactured washing machines retooled for artillery shells. The entire productive capacity of a continental nation pivoted toward a single purpose: victory. But nowhere was this transformation more dramatic, more symbolic of American industrial might, than in the shipyards that began constructing aircraft carriers at a pace the Japanese High Command considered physically impossible. The Japanese Naval General Staff had anticipated losses. War is attrition. They expected America to build replacements for the ships damaged at Pearl Harbor. Their own projections suggested the Americans might launch 1, perhaps 2 large carriers per year if they mobilized fully. Japan's own construction timeline for the Teiho, one of their most advanced carriers, required nearly 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, would consume 4 years of construction time. These were the realities of naval architecture: massive vessels requiring precision engineering, specialized materials, and thousands of skilled workers coordinating complex tasks over extended periods. The Japanese calculations were built on their own experience, their own industrial capacity, their own understanding of what was achievable in warship construction. They had not accounted for Henry Kaiser. Henry J. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He had never designed a vessel, never studied naval architecture, never apprenticed in maritime construction. He was a dam builder, a roads contractor, a man whose expertise lay in large-scale civil engineering projects completed ahead of schedule and under budget. He had built the Hoover Dam, constructed highways across the American West, and pioneered techniques in mass construction that revolutionized infrastructure development. When the war began, the U.S. Maritime Commission needed ships, desperately, urgently, in quantities that traditional shipyards could not possibly supply. They needed someone who understood not craftsmanship, but mass production. They needed someone who could think beyond conventional limitations. They found Kaiser. Kaiser looked at shipbuilding the way Ford had looked at automobiles, not as a craft, but as an assembly process. Traditional shipyards built vessels from the keel up, each ship a unique project requiring skilled artisans working in sequence. Kaiser proposed something radically different. Prefabrication, modular construction, assembly line methodology applied to vessels displacing thousands of tons. His engineers broke down ship construction into subassemblies that could be manufactured simultaneously in different locations, then welded together in massive sections at the shipyard. Welding replaced riveting, saving thousands of man-hours per vessel. Workers were trained in single specialized tasks rather than broad shipwright skills, allowing rapid workforce expansion. The traditional maritime establishment dismissed Kaiser's methods as crude, unsophisticated, likely to produce vessels that would break apart in heavy seas. They pointed to centuries of shipbuilding tradition, to the careful craftsmanship required for vessels meant to survive storms and combat. They warned that speed and mass production would result in poor quality, structural failures, catastrophic losses. Kaiser proved them wrong in the most public way imaginable. On November 12, 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary was assembled, launched, and fitted out at Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California in 4 days, 15 hours and 26 minutes from the moment the first keel plate was laid. 4 days. The vessel was 7,000 tons, 441 feet long, capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. It was seaworthy, functional, and combat-ready. The speed of construction shattered every assumption about industrial capability. But Liberty ships, while remarkable, were cargo vessels, relatively simple designs optimized for mass production. The true test of Kaiser's methods, the demonstration that would fundamentally alter Japanese strategic calculations, came with aircraft carriers. In 1942, the U.S. Navy faced a desperate shortage of carriers. The Lexington had been sunk at Coral Sea. The Yorktown went down at Midway. The Wasp and Hornet fell in the brutal Solomon Islands campaign. America was trading carriers with Japan at a rate that favored neither side, and the fleet carriers under construction in traditional Navy yards would not be ready for years. The Navy needed carriers immediately, not fleet carriers with their 18-month to 3-year construction timelines, but smaller, simpler escort carriers that could provide air cover for convoys, support amphibious landings, and hunt submarines. They needed them in quantities that seemed absurd. Kaiser proposed building 50 escort carriers in 18 months. The plan was met with skepticism bordering on derision. Escort carriers called jeep carriers, or less charitably, Kaiser coffins by some Navy personnel, were smaller than fleet carriers, displacing around 10,000 tons compared to the 25,000 tons of a Yorktown-class vessel. But they were still complex warships requiring flight decks, aircraft elevators, hangar bays, catapults, arresting gear, aviation fuel systems, ammunition magazines, radar installations, and all the machinery necessary for propulsion and combat operations. Building one in a few months seemed optimistic. Building 50 seemed delusional. Kaiser's team at the Vancouver, Washington shipyard delivered the first escort carrier, USS Casablanca, in less than 6 months. Then they built another, and another, and another. June 1943, Casablanca-class assembly line, Vancouver Shipyard, Washington. The shipyard operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts rotating through a facility that had grown from empty land to one of the largest industrial complexes on the Pacific coast in less than 2 years. Floodlights turned night into artificial day. The sound of welding torches hissed and crackled across acres of steel. Cranes hoisted prefabricated sections, entire bow assemblies, stern units, flight deck segments, into position with choreographed precision. Workers moved in coordinated teams, each person responsible for specific tasks repeated across multiple vessels simultaneously. Efficiency experts with stopwatches studied every movement, every procedure, seeking seconds that could be shaved from the construction timeline. The yard employed over 37,000 workers, many of them women taking industrial jobs for the first time, others drawn from farms and small towns across the Pacific Northwest. They learned to weld, to rivet, to read technical blueprints, to operate massive cranes and cutting equipment. They worked in rain and fog, through the gray winter months when the Columbia River ran cold and the wind cut through inadequate canvas windbreaks. They understood the urgency. Every week of delay meant sailors dying in the Pacific, convoys sunk by submarines, landing forces stranded without air support. At the peak of production, Kaiser's Vancouver yard was launching one Casablanca-class escort carrier every week. Every single week. The carrier slid down the ways with mechanical regularity. USS Liscum Bay on April 19, USS Coral Sea on April 27, USS Corregidor on May 12, USS Mission Bay on May 26. The schedule was relentless, the pace unprecedented. Each carrier left the yard fully equipped, ready for trials, ready for combat. 50 escort carriers were completed between April 1943 and July 1944, averaging one every 8 days across the entire production run. The mathematical reality was staggering. In the time it took Japan to complete one fleet carrier, American yards were launching 40 escort carriers. The industrial output represented not merely quantitative superiority, but a fundamental reimagining of what naval construction could achieve. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American naval production initially dismissed the reports as errors or propaganda. The numbers seemed impossible. When photographic reconnaissance confirmed the pace of construction, when carriers began appearing in combat operations across the Pacific with bewildering frequency, the Imperial Naval Staff was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had miscalculated American industrial capacity by an order of magnitude. Admiral Ugaki Madome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, recorded his growing dismay in his diary as 1943 progressed. He noted the appearance of new carriers in battle reports, the proliferation of escort carriers protecting convoys his submarines could no longer reach, the steady accumulation of American naval power that defied every strategic projection Japan had made. In one entry, he wrote of the inexhaustible American capacity, a capacity that transformed every tactical victory into a strategic defeat, because the Americans simply built faster than Japan could destroy. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. War is partly mathematics, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, aircraft lost versus aircraft produced, pilots killed versus pilots trained. The Japanese had entered the war with superior equipment, better trained pilots, more combat experience. They had assumed rough parity in production, believing their own industrial capacity adequate to sustain attrition against an opponent they viewed as less disciplined, less committed. The reality of American industrial output shattered that assumption. In 1943, the United States produced 27 escort carriers. Japan produced 2 carriers of all types. In 1944, the United States produced 33 escort carriers and 9 fleet carriers. Japan produced 3 carriers. The disparity was not merely numerical. It represented fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. Japan's carriers were individually superior vessels with longer range, heavier armor, and more sophisticated damage control systems. But superiority in individual vessels became irrelevant when facing overwhelming numerical advantage. The Casablanca-class carriers were not impressive warships by conventional standards. They were built on merchant ship hulls, lacked armor, possessed limited speed, and carried only 28 aircraft compared to the 70 to 90 aircraft of fleet carriers. Sailors joked grimly that their thin hulls would burst into flames if struck by a well-thrown rock. The nickname Kaiser coffins reflected genuine concern about survivability. Several escort carriers were indeed lost to submarine torpedoes and kamikaze attacks, their lack of armor proving fatal. But they were present. They provided air cover where no air cover had existed. They hunted submarines that would otherwise have decimated convoys. They supported amphibious operations across the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marianas to the Philippines. They trained replacement pilots for fleet carriers, served as aircraft transports, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and provided close air support for ground forces. They were functional, adequate, and numerous beyond Japan's capacity to counter. The escort carriers became symbols, floating manifestations of American industrial abundance. Japanese pilots returning from missions reported encounters with unknown American carriers, vessels not listed in intelligence briefings because they had been commissioned days earlier. The psychological effect was cumulative and corrosive. Every Japanese success, every carrier damaged, every convoy attacked, was offset by the knowledge that more American ships were already sliding down construction ways, that losses were temporary inconveniences in an industrial system that appeared infinite. Commander Fuchida, the same officer who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was reassigned to staff duty in 1943 after being wounded. From his position in naval headquarters, he had access to intelligence summaries, production estimates, and strategic assessments. He watched the American order of battle expand relentlessly, new carriers appearing monthly, tonnage numbers climbing beyond anything Japanese industry could match. In post-war interviews, Fuchida admitted that by mid-1943, thoughtful Japanese officers understood the war was mathematically unwinnable. American production had not merely matched Japanese losses. It had exceeded them by ratios that made victory impossible regardless of tactical skill or operational success. The Kaiser shipyards represented more than manufacturing capacity. They embodied a different conception of industrial warfare, one that treated combat vessels as consumable resources to be produced in quantity rather than precision instruments to be carefully conserved. The Japanese Navy treasured its carriers, named them after sacred mountains and legendary dragons, treated them as precious assets whose loss required elaborate explanations and ceremonial acknowledgement. American carriers emerged from Kaiser's yards with prosaic names like Coral Sea and Mission Bay, functional designations for functional tools. When the USS Liscum Bay was sunk by a submarine torpedo off Makin Atoll in November 1943, with the loss of 644 men, it was a tragedy. But the strategic impact was negligible because 5 more Casablanca-class carriers were launched in the following 5 weeks. April 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Staff officers gathered around tables covered with reconnaissance photographs and production estimates. The images showed American shipyards from California to Virginia, massive facilities where carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines emerged in assembly line precision. The photographs documented a reality that contradicted every assumption about American weakness, every belief in Japanese spiritual superiority, overcoming material disadvantage. One intelligence officer pointed to an annotated photograph of Kaiser's Vancouver yard. He had marked the positions of 6 escort carriers in various stages of completion, their hulls arranged in sequence like automobiles on a Ford assembly line. His finger traced the progression: keel laying, hull assembly, superstructure installation, flight deck fitting, outfitting, launch. The entire process visible in a single photograph, multiple vessels advancing through construction simultaneously. Another officer presented updated estimates of American aircraft carrier strength. As of April 1944, 15 fleet carriers, 65 escort carriers, with another 43 escort carriers and 7 fleet carriers under construction or fitting out. Japanese carrier strength: 4 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, with 2 under construction. The numbers sat heavy in the conference room, undeniable mathematics of strategic defeat. The officers discussed options with the careful language of men presenting futile alternatives. They could concentrate forces, achieve local superiority, inflict disproportionate losses in carefully chosen engagements. They could develop new tactics. Kamikaze attacks would emerge from such desperation in the coming months. They could appeal to spiritual strength, to Yamato Damashia, the spirit of Japan that supposedly transcended material considerations. But in the privacy of that conference room, looking at photographs of American shipyards where carriers emerged weekly, the truth was inescapable. Japan had miscalculated catastrophically, and no amount of tactical brilliance or spiritual resolve could overcome industrial reality. Admiral Yamamoto, who had warned of America's productive power before the war, had been killed in April 1943 when American fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. His death removed one of the few Japanese commanders who truly understood what they faced. The officers who remained, studying photographs of Kaiser's shipyards in the spring of 1944, now understood Yamamoto's warnings too late to matter. The escort carrier represented something beyond naval power. It was a floating argument for democratic industrial capitalism, a physical manifestation of political and economic philosophy. The Japanese had embraced a military-dominated society where resources flowed to the armed forces, where civilian consumption was sacrificed for military production, where individual desires were subordinated to collective national goals. They had assumed such organization granted them advantage over democracies, which they viewed as inefficient, divided, and soft. The Kaiser shipyards demonstrated the opposite. American industrial capacity emerged from a decentralized, competitive, innovative economic system that rewarded efficiency and punished waste. Henry Kaiser had no formal naval training, no government position, no military rank. He was a contractor who bid on a government project, won it through competitive process, and delivered results that exceeded every specification. His workforce consisted of volunteers attracted by wages and opportunity, not conscripts compelled by military discipline. His methods emerged from civilian industrial experience, not naval tradition. The escort carriers were built by welders who had never seen the ocean, by women who entered industrial work for the first time, by engineers solving problems through innovation rather than adherence to established doctrine. The very chaos and improvisation that the Japanese viewed as American weakness, the lack of rigid hierarchy, the questioning of authority, the constant search for more efficient methods, proved to be profound strength when channeled toward common purpose. This was the lesson the Japanese high command learned too late. Democratic societies at war possess latent capacities that authoritarian systems cannot match. The individual initiative, competitive innovation, and decentralized decision-making that seem inefficient in peacetime become overwhelming advantages in total war. The Japanese had organized their entire society for military production, and still could not compete with Americans who treated carrier construction as just another industrial challenge to be optimized. October 1944. Battle of Leyte Gulf, Philippine Sea. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, a task unit protecting the invasion beaches at Leyte, found themselves facing Admiral Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was a mismatch of grotesque proportions. The 6 escort carriers, USS Fancho Bay, USS St. Lo, USS White Plains, USS Kalinan Bay, USS Kitkun Bay, and USS Gambier Bay, were armed with 5-inch deck guns designed for air defense, not surface combat. Their top speed was 17 knots. Kurita's battleship Yamato could fire 18-inch shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds across 25 miles and steam at 27 knots. The Americans fought with desperate improvisation. The carriers turned south, launching aircraft armed with whatever ordnance was available, depth charges, high-explosive bombs, rockets, and pilots made repeated runs at Japanese capital ships, sometimes making dry strafing passes after exhausting ammunition, anything to disrupt Japanese targeting and buy time. Destroyers made suicidal torpedo runs through heavy shell fire, laying smoke screens and engaging cruisers with 5-inch guns. The USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts were sunk during close-range engagements that naval analysts later described as among the most heroic actions in U.S. Navy history. The escort carrier, USS Gambier Bay, took hits from heavy cruiser shells and sank, the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the war. The USS St. Lo was struck by a kamikaze aircraft and exploded, breaking in half and sinking in less than 30 minutes. Over 1,000 American sailors died that morning in the cold waters off Samar, but Taffy 3 held. Admiral Kurita, facing unexpectedly fierce resistance and believing he was engaging fleet carriers rather than escort carriers, lost his nerve. Concerned about American submarines, worried about air attacks from other carrier groups, confused by the ferocity of American counterattacks, he ordered withdrawal at the moment of potential victory. The invasion beaches, protected by carriers built in Kaiser's Vancouver yard, remained secure. In the aftermath, as survivors were pulled from the water and damage assessments compiled, the strategic significance became clear. The escort carriers, derided as Kaiser coffins, built with methods traditional shipbuilders dismissed as crude, had accomplished their mission. They had been present at the crucial moment, had provided air power where it was desperately needed, had fought beyond their designed capabilities, and had enabled strategic victory despite tactical defeat. 2 of the carriers sunk at Samar, USS Gambier Bay and USS St. Lo, were Casablanca-class vessels built at Kaiser's Vancouver yard. They had been commissioned less than a year earlier. Their loss was tragic, representing hundreds of lives ended and families shattered. But from the cold mathematics of industrial warfare, the strategic impact was minimal. 4 more Casablanca-class carriers were commissioned in the month following the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The shipyard that had built the lost carriers was already assembling their replacements. By the war's end, Kaiser's various shipyards had produced 1,490 vessels totaling 7 million tons, Liberty ships, Victory ships, escort carriers, tank landing ships, troop transports. 50 escort carriers alone came from the Vancouver yard, delivered on schedule, functional, combat-ready. Traditional naval architects who had dismissed Kaiser's methods were forced to acknowledge that crude, unsophisticated, mass-produced vessels won wars when available in sufficient quantity. The Japanese surrendered in August 1945 aboard the battleship USS Missouri, a vessel representing traditional naval power, heavily armored, massively gunned, carefully crafted in a Navy yard over 3 years of construction, but scattered across the Pacific, providing occupation support and transportation services, were dozens of Kaiser's escort carriers, unglamorous vessels that had done more to defeat Japan than any battleship. They had hunted submarines that would have strangled American supply lines. They had provided air cover for amphibious operations from Tarawa to Okinawa. They had trained the pilots who flew from fleet carriers. They had been present, functional, and numerous when presence and numbers mattered more than individual excellence. Admiral Ugaki, in his final diary entry before committing ritual suicide after Japan's surrender, wrote of the material avalanche that had overwhelmed Japanese forces. He noted that Japan's defeat resulted not from lack of courage or tactical skill, but from industrial capacity so vast that it transformed warfare itself. American production had created abundance where Japan faced scarcity, had treated carriers as disposable resources while Japan treasured each vessel as irreplaceable. The spiritual strength Japan had relied upon proved insufficient against an opponent who could absorb losses and return stronger, who could lose carriers in battle and replace them within weeks. The lesson was harsh and inescapable. Modern war is industrial, mathematical, economic. Tactical excellence and operational skill matter, but they cannot overcome orders of magnitude differences in productive capacity. The Japanese had entered war believing in their own propaganda about American softness, about the superiority of spiritual strength over material advantage. The escort carriers built by Henry Kaiser's shipyards, vessels dismissed by Japanese intelligence, derided by some American naval officers, constructed by workers with no maritime experience, delivered a verdict more definitive than any battle. Industrial democracy, for all its apparent inefficiencies and contradictions, could mobilize resources and coordinate production with effectiveness that militarized authoritarian societies could not match. Epilogue. The empty ways. The Vancouver shipyard closed in 1946. The workers dispersed, welders returning to farms, women reclaiming peacetime lives, engineers moving to new projects. The ways where carriers had launched weekly stood empty, silent, gradually reclaimed by rust and weather. The massive cranes fell still. The floodlights that had turned night to day went dark. But in the decades that followed, when historians calculated how America won the Pacific War, they returned repeatedly to those shipyards, to the production statistics that still seemed implausible, to the photographs showing carriers in assembly line formation like automobiles awaiting final touches. The escort carriers themselves, those that survived the war, were quickly decommissioned, sold for scrap, relegated to obscurity. They had been built for a specific purpose, delivered results beyond their design capabilities, and become obsolete almost immediately in the post-war world of jet aircraft and nuclear weapons. What endured was the lesson. The Japanese had dismissed American industry, had built their strategy on assumptions of rough productive parity modified by superior Japanese discipline and resolve. They learned, carrier by carrier, shipyard by shipyard, that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare in the modern age. They learned that democracies mobilized for war possess depths of capacity that authoritarian efficiency cannot replicate. They learned that the very individualism and decentralization they viewed as weakness became overwhelming strength when directed toward common purpose. Henry Kaiser returned to civilian construction after the war, building hospitals and housing developments and aluminum plants. He never built another warship. He didn't need to. The carriers his yards produced, crude, unsophisticated, good enough, had proven a point more profound than any single vessel could embody. They had demonstrated that American abundance was not a luxury of peacetime, but a strategic weapon in war. That industrial capacity translated directly into military power. That quantity possessed its own quality when organized with American efficiency. The last Casablanca-class carrier was stricken from the Naval Register in 1960. By then, they existed primarily in photographs and statistics, in the memories of men who had served aboard them and the families of those who had died in them. But their true legacy was conceptual rather than physical. They had changed how America thought about industrial mobilization, had proven that rapid mass production could deliver combat-effective vessels, had shown that wars of attrition favored economies that could treat complex military systems as consumable resources to be produced in quantity and replaced when lost. The Japanese commanders who dismissed American industry in 1941, who calculated that America lacked the will and capacity for protracted war, who believed that one decisive blow would force American withdrawal. They never anticipated Henry Kaiser and the Kaiser shipyards. They never imagined that carriers could be built weekly, that a continental nation's industrial capacity could be mobilized so completely and directed so effectively. They planned for a short war, for negotiations after initial Japanese victories, for an America that would accept new realities in Asia rather than engage in years of grinding industrial warfare. They discovered instead that they had awakened something immeasurably more dangerous than battleships. They had awakened the productive capacity of a democracy that, once committed, would not stop building until victory was absolute. The escort carriers were merely the most visible symbol of that awakening, floating testimony to American industrial might. Humble vessels that carried within their welded hulls the death sentence of the Japanese Empire. Every week, another carrier slid down the ways. Every week, the mathematics of strategic defeat grew more inexorable. Every week, Japanese commanders confronted fresh evidence that they had miscalculated catastrophically, that the soft, individualistic, undisciplined Americans possessed capacities beyond imagination, that industrial abundance was itself a form of warfare against which courage and tactical skill offered no defense. The shipyards stood silent now, but their lesson echoed through the decades. Never underestimate the industrial capacity of a democracy mobilized for war. Never assume that abundance in peace means weakness in conflict. Never mistake the apparent chaos of free markets and individual initiative for lack of organizational capacity. The escort carriers proved these truths at a pace of one per week, a rhythm of production that rewrote naval warfare